Hi everyone and welcome to a new video on the CBI channel. In this tutorial series we're creating a Django and React authentication system so that users can sign up, log in and log out inside of our app. This is not the first video in this series. In fact, we've already done 6 before, in which we've set up our Django backend and React.js frontend, created a custom user model and enabled all of the stuff on the frontend and backend that we would need to register users. In this video, we're going to continue and we're going to enable the login functionality using Django Knox. And today we're going to specifically do that for our Python Django backend. Now, to do that, we're going to be following 7 steps. First, we're going to install Django Rest Knox, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we use that for authentication. Next, we're going to make some changes to our settings.py file so that everything is configured for using Django Rest Knox. We're then going to add the URLs from Knox to our urls.py file, and we're going to migrate our database because Knox will create a few additional tables that we need for login. Once that is all complete, we're going to check out the results in our backend server, and then we're going to create a custom function for authenticating our users and finishing up with creating a view set and URL for login. And in the end, we will have all of the backend stuff configured so that users can log in. Let's start at the Django Rest Framework documentation for authentication to learn a little bit more about why we picked Django Knox. Now, within the Django Rest Framework, there are a few ways that you can authenticate users. You can do the basic authentication with HTTP. You can do token authentication. You can do session authentication. And you can also do remote user authentication. Now, typically, when you have a Django and React application, you will do either token or session authentication because you constantly are switching credentials between the front end and the back end to make sure that the back end knows that you can actually make those requests. Now, I'm used to always using the token authentication and typically using JSON web tokens, which kind of gives you a very long token that you can send between the front end and the back end. Now, if we look at the token authentication section, you can see that it's a fairly simple implementation. But if you want to do an implementation that allows more than one token per user, has some tighter security, and also supports token expiry, then you should look at Django Rest Knox. And that's the reason that we're going to do that inside of our application. The first step that we need to take when using Django Rest Knox is actually installing the package. And installing Knox is very easy. We can simply do pip install Django Rest Knox inside of our application. So I'm going to copy over this command and we're going to go to our code. And in there, I'm going to create a new terminal and go into our backend. So the first thing we do is cd into our backend. And then we're going to do venv/scripts/activate to activate our virtual environment. And now we can do the command pip install Django Rest Knox to install the package into our application. To make sure that this is going to be working okay, we also need to make some changes to our settings. And that is the next step. Now, the first thing you can see right here is that we need to add Knox to our installed apps. So inside of our app, we're going to go into our auth folder and then to the settings.py file. And on the top of the screen, under installed apps, we're going to add an entry for Knox, like this. Next, we also need to make sure that Knox's token authentication is the default authentication class. So we need to tell our app that Knox is going to do the authentication. And to do that, we need to put this string inside of the REST framework setting in our settings.py file. So I'm going to copy over this complete command right here. And we're going to go back again to our settings.py file. And underneath the WSGI application right here, doesn't really matter where you place it, I'm going to paste the REST framework setting and remove these dots right here. And now it knows that we're going to use Knox for the token authentication. As a next step, we're going to include the URLs that Knox provides by default inside of our URL patterns. And by including the Knox.urls, we will get a login, a logout, and a logout all URL, including views and everything that we need for authentication. So we're going to go to our urls.py file. And in there, similarly as what we did before, we're going to copy over this include statement. And we're going to change the path to API/auth, similarly as the example. And then in the include part, we're going to do Knox.urls, like this. And this will make sure that we have those URL patterns that I just showed you by default. Now, in terms of configuration, we're quite complete with what we've done so far. However, we also need to migrate our database to make sure that Knox has everything that it needs. Because the way that Knox works is that it's going to send tokens from our front end to our backend and the other way around. And that token is going to identify whether a user is authenticated or not. Now, of course, our database also needs to store these tokens somewhere. And to store them, Knox has provided a few models that we need in our database. So inside of our terminal, we're going to do python manage.py and then migrate. And you now see that it has applied all of the migrations and all of them are for Knox. And if I now open my database inside of this user interface, you will see that we have a new table called Knox_auth token. And this table will store all of the tokens that have been gifted to different users, including an expiration date, so that the token is only valid for a set time. So let's now start our server and see the results. So I'm going to do python manage.py run server. And now in our browser, when we go to /API/auth/login, you will see that we have this route right here that enables us to log into our application. But currently it says that we need authentication credentials to actually make this request. And the same goes for logout right here. And also when we do logout all, because those are the three options that Knox will provide us with. And that is all very nice and good. But actually, when we want to log in, we don't want authentication to block us. So what we're going to do is we're going to write our own authentication logic. Now, inside of our code, the first thing that I would like to do is actually create a new authenticate function. By default, Django has an authenticate function which takes the username and the password of a user. And based on that input, it is going to check whether the user is in the database. And if that is the case, then he can log in. However, in the previous videos, we've created a custom user model where we use the email field as the username. And this means that that authenticate function will no longer work. So to make sure that we have our own version of that, we're going to create it inside of our own application. So inside of our users folder right here, I'm going to create a new file, and that file is going to be called auth_backend.py. And we're going to start this file with an import. We're going to do from django.contrib.auth. We're going to import get user model. And then we're going to define the user as get user model like this, so that we know exactly what our user model is. Then we're going to define a class and we're going to call that email auth backend, because we want to authenticate using our email. Now inside of there, we're going to create a function called authenticate, and that is exactly the same name as the function that Django would provide by default. And inside of the functions, we're going to add the parameters of self, request, email is equal to none, and password is equal to none. And then we end it with a colon. Now, inside of authenticate, we're going to do a try and accept statement. So first, we're going to try to get our user. And we're getting the user by doing user.objects.get. And then we're going to check whether the user exists by comparing the email that is inside of our database to the email parameter that will be provided by the user in the request. And this is going to make sure that we know whether there's a user or not, and that it is defined right here. Next, we're going to check if the password that is provided actually is also okay, because a user can provide the right email, but we also want to know if it's the right password. So then we do if user.check password, which is just a function defined by Django, and then we're going to put in password as the parameter. So if that password check is going okay, then we're going to return the user. And if that is not the case, then nothing actually happens, so the user is not authenticated. Then we're also going to do the accept statement, because if you do try, you also need to put in the exception. And in the except, we simply state user dot does not exist. And this states that the exception is that the user does not exist. And if that is the case, we're just going to return none, because this needs to stop the process. Now, to be complete, we're also going to define a function called getUser, like this. And this will take in self and the user ID. And here again, we're going to do a try and except statement where we're going to try to return user.objects.get. And then we say that the primary key must be equal to the user ID. And if we cannot do that, so we have an exception, then we say user.does not exist. And then we return none. So the authenticate function is now complete, which means that we can use this to simply validate whether a user should be able to log in or not. However, we still need to tell Django that we want to use this authenticate function and not the one that uses the username and the password. So to do that, we're going to head over to our settings.py file, and in there we need to point Django towards our script for authentication. So we're going to go to our auth user model right here, and underneath that we define a new variable called authentication backend. And that is going to be equal to these square brackets and then the path to the file that we're going to be using. And it will be users.auth_backend.email auth backend. And what does this mean? Our script is inside of the users folder. The files is called auth backend, and our function is called email auth backend. And that is the reason that we actually name it like this inside of our settings.py file. So let's save that. And the last thing that we now need to do is we need to create a serializer, a URL, and a view set to tie everything together, because that will allow us to use some custom logic to log in the different users. We're going to start by creating a serializer, because that is what we will need to get the data from the front end in the JSON format, and then make sure that it is in a format that the Django database can actually read. So next to our register serializer, we're going to do a new class called login serializer. And this time it's not going to be a serializer.model serializer, but a serializers.serializer. Now in there, we're going to specify exactly what information we want to serialize. And the first thing is the email, which is going to be equal to serializers.email field, like this. What we'll also need to serialize is the password. And the password is going to be equal to serializers.char field, because it's going to be a character field that we're going to be receiving. Now you will know from our register serializer that we've put in this extra keyword arguments right here, so that our password is not exposed when we return the user. I want to do exactly the same thing for our login serializer, but since we're not using a model serializer, we need to do it a little bit differently than we've done before. And the way to do that is underneath the password, we're going to define a new function called toRepresentation. And this takes self and instance as the parameters. Now, actually, the content of that function is going to be red is equal to super two of these round brackets and then dot to representation. And in there, we're going to pass the instance. Next, we're going to say red.pop. And in there, we say that we want to populate the password. And then we do a comma and specify none. And then we return red. And now it knows that it does not need to return the password. And you can see that right here, it's going to have the representation. That is the complete instance. So that is everything right here. And here is going to say that the password population is not required. And that's why when we return this, it will make sure that the password is not visible. Okay, so now we have defined our login serializer, and it is time to also create a view set for our login. So we're going to go over to the views.py file, and in there we're going to start with a few imports. The first import that we're going to add is going to be from Knox.models. we're going to import auth token. And next to that, we're also going to say from django.contrib.auth, and we actually have specified that one already on the top right there. We're going to import the authenticate function next to the get user model. Now, we have of course changed the authenticate function, but by using this function, it will take a look at our settings and then use the function in our auth the backends.py. So that will work out all fine in the end. So now it is time to create a new view set. And we're going to say class login view set. And that is going to be equal to viewsets.viewset, similarly as what we've done before. Now we start the login view set with the permission classes, and in here we're going to specify permissions.allow any, because anyone is able to try to log in. We also need to define a serializer class, and the serializer class is going to be equal to the serializer that we've just created, which is the login serializer. Now, similarly as before, we can define the functions for creating them by simply specifying def create and then specifying the parameters of self and request. And now when we define the logic right here, every time a post request hits our serializer, it's going to know that we need to do this function right here. Now in the def create, we're going to build it up very similarly to the register view set that we have created previously. So we're going to start by defining the serializer, and we're actually just going to copy over that line. So we're going to start by saying that serializer is equal to self.serializer class, which is pointing to the login serializer, and we're going to serialize the data that is coming in through our request. Now next we're going to validate whether the serializer is actually valid. So we say if serializer dot is valid, then we are going to do something. Then we're going to do something, and else we're going to return a response. And inside of that response, we can do the same thing as before. We can print the errors and return a status of 400. Now, if the serializer is actually valid, the first thing I want to do is I want to extract the email and the password from the data. So I can use that to check whether we can actually authenticate the user or whether we cannot do that. So email in here is going to be equal to serializer.validated data. And then we do some square brackets and we specify that we are interested in the email field. Then we're going to do exactly the same thing for password. So let's just call this one password. And also specify that we want to get the information for the password. Okay, so once we have this data, we want to know whether the user is actually inside of our database and he has provided the right email and password. So we're going to set user equal to authenticate, and this is going to refer to this Django contrib.auth authenticate function, which is currently pointing towards our auth backend.py. And in this authenticate, we're going to mention the request. We're going to set email equal to the data from email and password equal to the data from password. Now what this will do is will trigger the function in our auth backend, and it will check based on the email and the password if the user exists and also whether the user has the right password. After we know whether the user is able to authenticate or not, we're going to put that in an if statement, and if the user has authenticated correctly, we're going to create a token for that user so the user can use that during his time online. And we're also going to put in a response for when the user has not successfully authenticated. So in here, we're going to say if user, and this either says that the user is there or is not there. If the user is there, then we're going to do an underscore and a comma, and then we define token is equal to auth token dot objects dot create, and we're going to create a token for the user. Now, what this does is this basically generates a tuple. And the first part of the tuple is going to be empty, because an underscore means that it is empty. And the second part of this tuple is going to be the token. And in here we also specify that an auth token entry is going to be created inside of our database for this particular user input. And if we go to the user interface, you can also see that we use auth token because the name of the model is actually auth token in our database. So after we have successfully created this token entry for this user, we also want to return it to the front end so that we can use it to do all of the logic in there. So we're going to return a response. And in here, we do some round brackets, and we're going to define a tuple like this. And the first part of this is going to be user. And in here, we're going to define self.serializer class. And we're going to pass in the user.data. And the next part is we're also going to provide them with a token. And the token, we can simply say that we want to pass in token. Like this. Now, it can also happen that this user has not successfully authenticated. And in that case, we also want to give a response. So in there, we say return response. We're going to open round brackets and then a tuple as well. Within the tuple, we provide a little error message that states invalid credentials. And then we're going to pass in a status of 401, which is unauthorized, like this. And just like that, we have created all of the logic for authenticating the user and returning the token to our front end if everything is complete. Okay, so our view is now ready, and we have all of the logic for authenticating a user and returning the token to the front end. Now, the last thing we also need to do is we need to create a URL for this so that we know where we can actually send this endpoint to. So we're going to go over to our urls.py file, and I'm just going to copy over the root that we had for register. And I'm just going to say that it's going to be equal to login. We're going to use our login view set, and the base name is going to be login as well. And now let's open our application in the browser and see what we see when we go to the login endpoint. So we are now inside of our browser, and you can see that a second line has showed up for the login endpoint. And if we click it, you can see that it expects the email and the password just as we were thinking. Now, in the previous video, you can already see that we've created a user with the email of email@email.com, and the password is hashed, but I know that it is going to be equal to testing321. So now let's see if we want to authenticate with this user, whether we get the correct response. So in here, we specify email@email.com. And in the password section, we do testing321. And let's see what happens when we click post. Okay, you can now see that it has accepted our response. And what we return is indeed the user email of email@email.com. And we're also being returned a token. So that's quite nice. And when we look inside of our database and we go to the auth token table, you will see that right here we have a token. We have the moment that it has been created. We have a link to the user that has requested it. And we also have an expiration time. So you can see that this one is going to be valid until somewhere tomorrow. Now let's see what if I try to authenticate with email@email.com, but we have a password which is testing321, which is wrong. If we now do the post request, we get the error of invalid credentials. And when we go to our view, you can see right here that it triggers this particular one because the user has not authenticated successfully. So it seems that this stuff is all working perfectly. And that is actually all that we're going to be doing for today. In this video, we have implemented the logic for authenticating users using Django Rest Knox. In the next video, we're going to continue and we're going to make sure that we can send these requests from our React.js frontend to our backend, and also make sure that we can use that authentication token to continue in our frontend. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, please leave a like and subscribe because that really helps. And I hope to see you in the next video. Bye bye.